one of the things that you've become renowned for is your illustration of an incredibly complicated and sophisticated network of interests, of industry, manufacturing, banking, financial, but also security, spyware. It's something that I don't think anyone can fail to notice, that wherever you go, in whatever airport, whatever shopping mall sometimes. I go to some Muslim countries, European countries, and the shopping mall, when you enter and there are metal detectors, you can't fail but recognize that the software being used is a software that has a HQ which is in Israel. Mm. But this network of interests, and you've spoken about this a lot, this is something that is part and parcel of the whole struggle. I mean, this is part and parcel of from my point of view, for instance, as a political analyst, as a political commentator, I talk about the evils of occupation, about the humanitarian situation, about what the international agencies such as the UN should do. But there is a side to the struggle which I, for instance, and I take it that the majority of people aren't aware of, and that is those kind of networks of interests. Tell me a little bit about this.
Well, one of the most illustrative sentences that Moshe Dayan ever uttered was post-1967. He said, "We need to find a way to make the occupation invisible." And when you look at the way the telecommunications industry developed in Palestine, and really it was turbocharged post-Oslo, because at the time of Oslo, you had a really small percentage, perhaps 4% of the Palestinian population even connected on a house basis to phone lines at that point, which is unbelievable to imagine, but that is the case as far as I understand. But the Oslo process opened up the space for the founding of these telecommunications companies, which connected the entire Palestinian population to constant communication. Now, that happened under the auspices of the Israeli Ministry of Communication. All of the equipment that was used by these companies, which were then founded, these Palestinian communications companies, had to go through the Israeli military. They could only build in places which the Israeli military gave them permission to build. For example, their system of even being taxed for what they did was massively different from the way that Israeli companies would process things. But then the other part of this was it changed a particular unit within the Israeli military, Unit 8200. This is the equivalent of GCHQ in Britain. And Unit 8200 then had a huge amount of more information to go over in terms of understanding the Palestinian population. And you've had whistleblowers from within that unit come out and say, around 30 to 40 whistleblowers, say, we're using this information to blackmail Palestinians, whether it would be on issues of their personal life, whether it would be on other things that they may not want people to know, whether it be if they have a family member that has an illness. That sort of informational advantage was granted to the Israelis massively through telecommunications. In addition to that, you see in several of the key assassinations that Israel has carried out, Al-Hamouri in Paris, for instance, was carried out by them planting explosives in his phone. In the 70s during Operation Wrath of God, the Golda Meir. But then later on, you have a similar kind of assassination carried out against Ayyash in Gaza, but then also Abdelaziz Rantisi. The assassination of him particularly was using the GPS signal from the phone to identify where he was. So the phone and information gathered through it has definitely been a kind of invisible and silent weapon that Israel's used. Now, when it relates to our societies is when the neoliberal era, which is the era where our political class become convinced of the idea that private corporations are better suited to fulfill the role of the state than the state is. So what that leads to is numerous state functions essentially being outsourced to private companies. And then this is the opportunity for Israel through Unit 8200, which by this time we're talking, 2012 really is when the decision is made. It becomes a prestigious unit that has a lot of pride around the world, because the people that come out of it are then producing companies that offer services to other states. But the people that come out of that unit are still connected in an umbilical way to the Israeli state. And so from that, you get, for instance, the NSO group, who you know better than many about. You have Celebrite, which is a company kind of seen as a sort of alternative to the NSO group, but still performs the same kind of functions, which is phone hacking. So you have the British police now in this country hacking phones with a company which is an outgrowth of Israeli intelligence, Celebrite. And that sort of changed the way that happened, because Britain is not exceptional in that regard. Many states around the world, including key Arab states, which we can speak about also, use the same company, but also use similar companies. And in 2012, you had a policy which at the time was secret, taken by the Netanyahu government. It was later reported in Calculus Tech in an article. This is an important Israeli tech magazine, that the article specifically states that it has passed through the Israeli military censor, meaning that the content of the article is something that the Israeli military accepts as fact. And in the article, it stated very clearly that Netanyahu had a policy in 2012 to move individuals from Unit 8200 into private companies and then begin working around the world in ways that could benefit the state of Israel.
I mean, what you're describing, on one level, some might think that, well, states behave like that. But in actual fact, when we're talking about the application of all of this, we're talking about ordinary people, ordinary citizens being monitored, being subject to these surveillance apps, surveillance methods and the such. What happened to privacy? I mean, I thought that privacy was sacrosanct. I thought that privacy was something that no one looked into your messages or your letters or your such, but it seems that, I think that, what was it, 15 years ago, when there was a big scandal around the proliferation of CCTV cameras in a particular district of Birmingham, which was notorious for having a number of mosques and a large population of Muslim families. And that was the first time when there was, let's say, a public debate about what are we doing regarding, the monitoring of everyone's move. I think there was someone who quite incredibly came out again, probably in the decade before last, and proclaimed that London, you couldn't be away from a camera for more than something like 2.5 minutes. Yep. If you're moving throughout the day, which is,
if that, I imagine,
which is incredible. I mean, you think that this would be for the reason of safety, but with the rise of crime and burglary of various sorts, it's not really that, is it?
Absolutely. And the interesting thing with the cameras is that now it's beyond just monitoring a moving object, as in a person. The NICE Systems, for example, which is a subsidiary of Elbit Systems, which the British police use for investigations. But more interestingly than that, Glasgow city centre uses NICE Systems on its CCTVs. And
NICE is a brand.
NICE is the brand.
It's not a compliment that you're paying.
Yeah. It's quite smart actually, because if you think about kind of the mental trick that sort of carries out by calling it that. But so there's 3 ways in which Nice Systems has a presence in Britain, in Scotland, and in Ireland that it shouldn't. So firstly, in the Scottish case, it carries out facial recognition on the CCTV in the town centre. Now that was technology developed on the Palestinians. And as I say, Nice Systems is a subsidiary of Elbit, which is Israel's largest arms company. In terms of the British context, the British police also use Nice Systems. It's unclear in what exact ways they use it. I think the interesting point about Celebrite is also the Foreign Office use it. So then we're getting into the possibility of, obviously, the Foreign Office oversees MI6. Is Britain's external intelligence agency outsourcing its functions to an outgrowth of Israeli intelligence? That's an interesting part of this. But then the thing with Nice Systems is that even in the Republic of Ireland, which is among the most pro-Palestinian states on paper, I would say, that exist in Europe for sure.
Yeah.
Alan Shatter, who was their Minister of Justice and is an Israel lobbyist now, said that they replaced the recorders in the police stations with Nice Systems machines while he was the Justice Minister. So then you're getting into a question of, okay, someone that's gone on to be an Israel lobbyist while he was the Justice Minister would have had something to do with that deal, sort of an insinuation of Israeli power into very sensitive part of the Irish system. But what's also fascinating about the Celebrite case is Celebrite, of all the Israeli companies, is used by the Pakistani intelligence services. It's used by the Venezuelan government. It was used by the Russians until the Ukraine situation. So what's happened here is Israel, through Unit 8200 and through the use of the Palestinians as a guinea pig population, have been able to portray themselves as the global experts on control and spying on other human beings. And so even to governments who are, one would imagine that the Russian government for sure would not have this weakness in terms of its own institutions. You could understand it maybe in the British context. You wouldn't understand it in the US context because, of course, the US is the way that the Israelis have been able to get access to classified stuff in the US has been through the cybersecurity, which is a less direct method, but is pretty significant too. You're talking about seriously classified databases of the Department of Defense. Their cybersecurity is being delivered for the Lockheed Martin, for example, cybersecurity being delivered for them by Israeli companies. Can you trust where that information goes? I think even the history of Israeli espionage in the United States, including tapping Bill Clinton's phone, including spying on the White House during the Donald Trump years, including the Promise software scandal. This kind of stuff would lead you to believe that the US needs to have a far more robust form of assuring the security of its data. I would say one thing that's even more sweeping than all of that is this cross-pollination between the Israeli security services, the US security services, and the British security services. And that really, the scariest example is Oracle. So Oracle provides the data services for the British Ministry of Defence, for the Home Office, for the Foreign Office, and the National Health Service in this country. Now, Oracle was set up initially to service the CIA by Larry Ellison. He's believed to be the 4th to 7th richest man in the world. There's some disagreement on where he falls in that regard.
But he's not poor, by him.
He's certainly not. He's certainly not. But his angle is interesting because he's somebody that historically is one of the largest funders of the Friends of the IDF in the history of the organization. He's somebody who is such a close friend to Benjamin Netanyahu that he is due to testify on Netanyahu's behalf in the corruption trial, which is not happening because Netanyahu is going to war with the rest of us. But worse than that, this company, Oracle, offered the directorship of the company to Netanyahu.
Wow.
So what we're saying is that the company responsible for holding the data of the MOD, the Home Office, the Foreign Office, and the NHS literally offered its directorship to Benjamin Netanyahu.
You know, Karim, help me out here because, I'm someone who always precedes a lot of what we say by, I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but only a few years ago, we had a huge scandal, which was called the phone hacking scandal. This seems to be on a totally different level. I mean, we had a scandal whereby millions were paid out to victims of journalists who managed to somehow manipulate the voicemail of a teenage girl who ended up being killed. And that was as big as they got, and as big as it seems to someone, a layman like myself, that it could get. But you're talking on a totally different level. You're talking on a global surveillance project.
Potentially.
Now, okay, so the question that comes is why?
Well, I mean, with the Larry Ellison case, I certainly cannot say categorically that information is going to the Israelis. What we can say is that the CEO of Larry Ellison's company, Oracle, Safra Katz, who is herself Israeli, has gone on record as saying that Israel is of primary concern to us as a company, and if our employees have any problem with our relationship with Israel, then they can find another company, unbelievably. So from my perspective, what I would say is I would question how safe the information going into Oracle is. But another aspect of the Oracle story and the procurement of the contract is a real cause for concern. So Larry Ellison had a charity called the Larry Ellison Foundation, which was based here in this country. Who was employed as the head of the charity, which didn't do much apart from seemingly funnel money to the Tony Blair Foundation. Its head was Boris Johnson's father-in-law while Boris Johnson was Prime Minister. Now, what happens when Ellison procures the contract for Oracle, the same month the contract is procured, the Larry Ellison Foundation in Britain shuts down.
Wow.
So Boris Johnson's father-in-law was getting £500,000 per year to work for this.
Is this public knowledge?
Only insofar as I've tweeted about it, but it's we used to have
a
journalistic sort of strand. Absolutely, we used to have a sort of investigative strand of journalism in this country. You'd have someone like John Pilger, you'd have Private Eye. You'd have some good work done, and you still do to some extent. However, as you will well know because you've been through the sort of demonization stuff, often that happens because a button has been pushed, and that button is often pushed by somebody in a particular position of influence, which is often not somebody directly working at the paper. But then all of a sudden, all the papers are basically almost rewording the same press release. You've seen it.
Yes.
So the kind of individual...
Including the typos, by the way. It's a copy-paste, including the typos.
Amazing.
Yeah.
And then the sort of interaction between that and the institutions which we rely on to administer, whether it's banking, whether it's other things, the relationship is really interesting how all of that plays out. But in this case, it would take somebody doing what I did, which is looking at the tax filings of the Larry Ellison Foundation as a charity, looking at who was employed by it. It wasn't only Carrie Simmons' father, who was employed by it. It was several high-ranking figures in governmental departments at the same time. So you had people working in the Foreign Office, working for this charity at the same time as Ellison was bidding for this massive contract. I mean, it's humongous, the Oracle contract. So it calls into question the safety of that information. Another aspect of how this country, whether the information is or isn't safe, has to be British Telecom. So British Telecom in the last year has had a stakeholder takeover. So the largest shareholder in British Telecom today is Patrick Drahi. Now, Patrick Drahi is a French-Israeli billionaire. Now, as soon as he took the majority stake in British Telecom, it triggered a national security investigation by the British government.
Okay.
They did not say why, but and I think this is fair to say, that there was suspicion on the parts of some in the British establishment that this individual works for the Israelis in some capacity, and I'll explain why. Patrick Drahi is also the founder and owner of I-24, the I-24 news channel.
Okay.
Now, I-24 in this recent period was the channel responsible for the 40 beheaded babies claim. And the Haaretz investigation several years ago found that I-24 was working as a proxy for the Netanyahu family.
Wow.
So we are not alone in having these suspicions about these particular ways in which, and he bought, for instance, the Liberation newspaper in France, which was founded by Jean-Paul Sartre, and replaced the editor with somebody who had come out of Unit 8200. So all of these are questions. They're not assertions. I cannot say categorically that our information and our phone calls are being given to a foreign intelligence agency. What I can say is individuals that are close to to that particular foreign agency, and as I've demonstrated, very close to particularly Benjamin Netanyahu, are in situations of sensitivity when it comes to national security.
I mean, listen, all that you're saying and all that you have said on your social media posts and the such, and also the public speaking engagements in which you've illustrated elements of these connections, they make for absolutely fascinating and quite intriguing, they provoke the mere question that, what's going on. There seems to be an exclusive club of wheelers and dealers, partly from the intelligence community, partly from the political community, partly from the media community and the financial community. There seems to be, as I said, the same name. And we talk about conflict of interest within small companies run by 2-3 people, and we make them seem to be, something which is nigh on creating a public security threat. But yet here we are talking about a conflict of interest in an industry that is so dangerous.
Yeah.
If put in the wrong hands.
Absolutely.
And yet there seems to be almost no murmur about all of this. This is problematic to the extreme. Now, you mentioned that you started off with the Moshe Dayan and post 1967, and then you said that this was after Oslo in 1992, 1993. Is it that we entered after 9/11 a phase of time, the war on terror time, when people became a little bit lax with their own privacy, with affording governments more and more slack when it comes to invading their own privacy under the pretense that, we're being protected? Do you think that 9/11 played a role?
Absolutely. The Patriot Act was sweeping and gave on that exact basis the rights to do everything, monitor bank accounts in real time. That was the US, and that didn't apply here, though you have recent legislation that's been passed here which will allow the government to monitor bank accounts in real time of people that they have suspicions about. These are obviously gross violations of people's privacy. In the case of banks, though, the kind of incestuous relationship with intelligence agencies has been there. HSBC is a perfect example. Where you had a former very high-ranking figure in MI5 go directly into heading up HSBC. And of course, that coincided with the targeting of Muslims in this country. At the same time, you had Shawcross with the Charity Commission and all of the consequences that led to. I think we also need to have more clarity, and that's difficult because it's not publicly announced, but more clarity about the extent of integration between the US and Britain. There's 12,000 US soldiers in this country. Oracle is primarily a creature of the CIA. It has a high-ranking figure there, if not I think the deputy director is former CIA, but also it serviced the CIA and was set up for that purpose. So with the US having full access to things in this country, Israel has kind of gone along in, I would say, the last few decades in a kind of elevated way. But imagine this, there's an organization called the UK Israel Tech Hub. Pardon me. Now, the UK Israel Tech Hub is based within the British Embassy. And it's staffed by former Israeli military and intelligence personnel. It's headed by a gentleman called Haim Shani, who is the former Director General of the Israeli Ministry of Finance. Now, this organization, which exists inside the British Embassy, has the stated objective of procuring public sector contracts for Israeli tech companies in Britain. And who's it funded by? It's funded by the British Foreign Office, it's funded by the British Department for Trade, and it's funded by the embassy itself. So can you imagine that British taxpayers are funding an organization that has the stated objective of procuring public sector contracts for what is essentially companies that are an outgrowth of a foreign intelligence agency? That's how you get Celebrite, which, by the way, Haim Shani was simultaneously a director of at the same time as he was Director General of the UK Israel Tech Hub. And same for Nice Systems. He was the director of Nice Systems at the same time as Director General of the UK Israel Tech Hub. So we're being taken for a ride in quite an extraordinary way. And when we get to the point where now Israel is committing genocide, and that is a perception which, when we're out there, 2008, 2009, demonstrating, gathering, talking to people, okay, we're a couple of 100,000 people. And it was strongly felt within our community. It was a source of pain, bitterness, and real tribulation for us all on a personal level. But now we're at a stage where that perception that Israel is committing genocide in Gaza is, I would say, a majority of humanity has that perception. And even when looking at and this is, a slightly different direction, but when we look at the governments which designate Palestinian armed resistance, which is their right under UN Resolution 3246, to Israeli occupation as terrorism. Okay, so you've got the British government, which supposedly represents about 60, 70 million people. Okay, you've got the US government, which supposedly represents a few 100 million people. Okay, you've got the Japanese government, and you've got the EU. So let's put them all together. It's less than 1 billion human beings are represented by governments that designate Palestinian armed resistance categorically as terrorism. What about the rest of the governments in the world?
Yeah.
What about the government of Turkey? Less than 100 million people? Okay. What about the government of Venezuela? What about the government of Iran? What about the government of China, over 1 billion people? What about the government of Russia, several hundred million people? And you fast get to the point where you can at least track over 1 billion people, at least in the world, being represented by governments that do not designate these organizations in that particular way. So what you come to the point is where you say the majority of humanity is represented by governments that see what Israel is doing as genocide. The majority of humanity are represented by governments that don't perceive resistance to what Israel does as terrorism. You know, we, in terms of our political space, are more in tune with the perception of the majority of the world than these particular forces who are, in many cases, you know, now you have an interesting point where a lot of pressure is being put on the police and the CPS separately by Israel lobby groups like the Board of Deputies, Community Security Trust, even the Israeli Embassy, to use the IHRA definition in cases. And you didn't have that. But it was always going to be, unfortunately, the natural conclusion of what happened in the Corbyn years, unfortunately, is that you'd get to the point where they would start to wield the very same stuff they were wheeling out against us in a sort of more legal way. But then the main protector is going to be the juries. Is the juries and also the CPS. There is some resistance that seems to be kind of being asserted. So it's a very amazing time. I underestimated, unbelievably. I think we underestimated, as bizarre as it sounds, the scale of brutality. And, we knew Israel's capacity for brutality was limitless. But I didn't necessarily see the tolerance for that brutality. And actually worse than tolerance now we see with the cutting of the UNRWA stuff. Direct complicity in it being as limitless as it is. I mean...
What's your hope for the ICJ case that the South Africans brought?
I mean, me personally, I see it as the interim ruling which was issued was massively encouraging. And I say why, because the perception that a lot of us had were that the judges would vote in line with their government's position. And the only judge which a government came out and said this judge is not voting in line with their government's position was the Ugandan government, who was voting in line with Israel. And so to have the judge from the UK, the judge from the US, really vote in a way that we did not expect them to is a cause.
I think it's a credit to the case itself.
Absolutely.
And the dossier that was presented. And like many, many legal experts who commented on the media in the days before, to a man and woman all saying that the case is infallible and that it's very, very difficult to find against. And even the Israeli defense team who spoke on the second day and by the grace of God was covered fully by the BBC, we got to see that, actually didn't go to respond point by point as a defense would normally do to the case, but they went on various directions talking about the history of the Holocaust and the prosecution of the people of a Jewish faith in Europe in the last century and the such. But the mere spectacle, and this is something that I've spoken about, the mere spectacle of a legal team from South Africa standing man after woman after man after woman, talking so brilliantly, uninterrupted, for 8 hours.
It was touching.
In front of the entire world. I mean, in my memory, that's never happened before. And in a global platform such as the ICJ, that is unheard of. But again, obviously, then we had the immediate reaction of not only America, which is expected, but our own government here in the UK, various other governments, directing their attacks on UNRWA, on the UN Relief and Works Agency, and claiming that many of its staff were complicit somehow or sympathized with the attacks on the 7th of October. So now we have another line, a direct attack on the people of Gaza, whom were hoping that the ICJ's provisional measures regarding allowing aid would give a little bit of relief, a little bit of... It shows us, and you're absolutely right. I mean, you knew that there were brutal decision makers and people who were heartless, those kind of romantic descriptions that we often use as politicians, but you never thought that there would be such a sustained, relentless, absolutely despicable attack on every single child in Gaza, every single woman, every single man. You never thought that you'd actually see it, live through it. And it's been going on not for days, not for weeks, but now we're coming onto what, 4 months?
Yeah.
It's incredible. And I think it speaks for the kind of world order within which we live. Whether we're talking about international law, whether we're talking about the international community per se. And, you went and very briefly described how, those who outlawed the armed resistance of the Palestinians, and that they barely make something like 15% of the world population. But in a way, the international community, that's the problem of the international community. I mean, you have a Security Council, which is made up of what? Of who? I mean, how much of the world population do they make? So you'd like to think that the natural outcome of all of this is a radical transformation of how things are. And, the way that people are talking now, it's not about changing a face or a name. You would have expected people to say, well, it's just Netanyahu. If Netanyahu goes, everything will be okay. But actually, more and more people are now questioning the very idea of Israel, of Zionism, and more of what you're telling us about those connections, those, the trails of money and the such, about espionage and surveillance and the like. Just a few weeks ago, we had the Epstein scandal and the names. And again, people pointed to, going back to Robert Maxwell and to that particular link and the like. And it's it might have taken Gaza and the horrific pain and suffering over the course of the past 100 and so days for people to start asking those questions. Do you feel that we're in the throes of a transformative moment, maybe?
I feel it can be, but we have to be careful about what we allow, particularly the United States and Britain, to get away with in terms of PR, because Israel has two markets of consumption for its PR, which are at odds. So the Israeli government has to appeal to the Israeli population, which is certainly the most right-wing, with fascistic tendencies as a population. It has and part of it comes out of the failure of what they call the first Aliyah. So the first Aliyah, the movement of which preceded Theodor Herzl, it was the movement of European Zionists to Palestine in the late 1800s. And it was perceived as a failure because they employed Palestinians to till the soil. And so then that led to the strand of muscular kibbutzism, which was this idea of Europeans doing it for themselves under the sun, but also this understanding of the division of labor, whereby you had to have separate institutions that were labored by only Jewish people. One of the only places in Palestine that didn't have that was the railways. So where you had Palestinians and Zionists working together. But other than that, and then also obviously the British mandate had within it the legal obligation to implement the Balfour Declaration, which meant setting up separate institutions for Jewish people and for indigenous Palestinians, Muslims and Christians. So where those fascistic tendencies come from is in that idea of an authentic core. Mm. But the most sort of contradictory aspect of it is that when you look at the grandfather clause, so the law of return, which says that any person that has a Jewish grandparent can go and become an Israeli citizen. When you look at the influx of Indian laborers now being brought in to replace the Palestinian construction workers, Ecuadorian labor, thousands, tens of thousands being brought in. These are non-Jewish people. The society has aspirations or pretensions of being an exclusivist Jewish utopia. And so it's a sort of fantastical, idealistic idea which sacrifices others for the greater good, which cancels the humanity of other people for the greater good. But what it is in actuality is quite a melting pot, because Hebrew, even as a language, was not spoken. It was not spoken until the Zionist movement had to artificially produce this sort of renaissance of the language from being a language of religious practice to being a language spoken on a daily basis. I mean, Theodore Herzl, one of the things he said, we are not Europeans now, but we will be when we're in Palestine. And he perceived, I mean, he died in 1905. So, I understand those that would say he wouldn't have a realistic perception, but he perceived the language of the state to be German. He said, when the state is set up, we'll speak German. So anyway, that was quite a tangent. But my point was that my fear in the potential for transformation, it's transformation certainly in terms of perception, as you will have seen too. And I've seen people who previously were indifferent to this cause, which has been of great importance to us. They now are adopting it in a very passionate way. And that's really exciting and brilliant. The worry is the extent to which that can then become reflected within intransigent political systems. And then the worry in the US context is if Trump is next, which seems less of an if day by day, the Israeli government has been funding several organizations, the most important one, the Temple Institute, and they've been funded by the Israeli Ministry of Culture and the Israeli Ministry of Education for several decades now. The stated objective of this organization is the complete disappearance of Al-Aqsa and the replacement of it with a temple which they believe to have existed twice in human history, once to have been destroyed by the Romans, another time by the Persians, according to the belief that some have. Now, this organization historically had an antagonism with the Israeli military, the Temple Institute and supporters of the Temple movement, the Temple Mount movement. They were arrested by Israeli police and stopped by Israeli soldiers from launching terrorist attacks on Al-Aqsa. Now, their relationship is so hand in glove, and it's since the Gilad Erdan period, 2015 or so, but it precedes that, whereby people now, and this is according to an Israeli army investigation, not me. The Israeli army investigation found that the Israeli government was offering, as an alternative to conscription, membership of this organization. So to that extent, it's being state-sanctioned, the destruction of Al-Aqsa. So that's the next phase. The emptying of the West Bank, the all-out war with Lebanon, these are the next phases, and they're ugly. They're really ugly, these next phases. And Trump has the grit, the steel, the determination to carry out these things. And I think, especially in the sort of the Arabic-speaking societies side of it, one of the leftovers from the Trump years, which has received zero scrutiny during this period, is a company called Affinity Group, a hedge fund, which is run directly by Jared Kushner. But he started it with $2 billion from the Saudi government. Affinity Partners is its name. It's currently an owner of an Israeli motor company called the Shlomo Group. Now, the Shlomo Group has been equipping the Shaudag and the and one other unit in the Israeli military since October 7th, with military equipment and with vehicles throughout the operations in Gaza. So this is a company which has Saudi money within it.
Yep.
And so the Abraham Accords were about the integration of these forces in the region and enabling Israel to have, you know, the UAE, for example, have something called Edge Group, which is an investment firm owned by the UAE state. It has around $15 million invested in an Israeli drone company, which works with on their airspace. It's been tested by the Israeli Air Force. It's used by the Israeli police. You know, they also have a subsidiary of Elbit Systems in the UAE. So the Trump era allowed Israel to integrate these regional forces into a war effort, even in a silent way, as has, you know, been done with Gaza this time. This is unprecedented. You know, you look at the US involvement in Gaza, they've sent US Air Force officers to help Israel with targeting. You know, it probably happened before. We didn't know that it happened. You know, it was only until The Intercept published this. You know, Biden has constantly been selling them more and more and more weapons. And this was what Netanyahu said a few days into the war. He said, the one thing we need from the US is munitions, munitions, munitions. And they've been getting it. But the British involvement, I think this is why the ICJ has the potential to tear apart the accepted, quote unquote, rules-based order, which is led by these particular powers in the global north. Because British, US, and German, I mean, the German arms sales to Israel increased by 1,000% throughout this war. They're going to be absolutely blown open and exposed. And, you know, I'm not a legal expert or a lawyer, but I believe there will be some form of legal vulnerabilities for the US, Britain, and Germany.
Let's hope so. Let's hope so. Listen, I have to talk to you about your other side, and that is your artistic side. You're known to be a rapper that appeals to countless young people. Now, the first thing I'd like to ask is what made you so political? What was it that made you so political?
I mean, I think with both of my parents, they had their own political experiences. They both came from political families in quite different ways. I think we were given, to some extent, a political education at home. I do feel, though, that what sort of radicalizes us is the context. It's not just the stories and the experiences of our parents, because, you know, were we to have existed in a political context which didn't sort of racialize you, you know, being stopped under Schedule 7 Terrorism Act, being detained by the police as a teenager, these kind of things ultimately push you towards some quite radical conclusions about sort of who you are and where you fit into the society, whether you like it or not. You know, you as a child can have pretensions of not being an outsider, but there are mechanisms of sort of discipline within the society that kind of let you know you're not really of us. And so then that kind of pushes you more to the margins. But then obviously the Iraq War, Gaza, you know, you start to look at the state as having
How old were you when Iraq?
Iraq, I was, so 2003, I was 16, 17. Not.
Were you fully aware of what was going on?
Yeah, I was aware of what was going on, but I wasn't, what I didn't grasp, and this is since marrying someone, she's Iraqi, she came to the country 2009. I didn't grasp the way at that time that war manifests on the micro level. So I had a sort of concept of how it operated on a macro level. I had a great-grandmother who was in Lebanon, in Beirut, when the Israelis invaded. We still had a bullet from when they shot into her apartment. And so you had these kind of macro understandings, that these periods of time had, we were intermarried with Palestinians. So I had some concept and close to Palestinian families. So I had some concept of that and how these big things spatially change people and what people have access to in people's lives. But I didn't get how on a micro level, even that process that was happening in 2003 would then manifest in my own nervous system, let alone the nervous system of other people and then people that I'd know, how that destabilizing force and that kind of feeling of a lack of safety, while obviously, comparatively, it's absolutely nothing compared to people that were, in Iraq at the time. But even us here, Sinan Antoun, he called Iraqis during that period like barbarians in Rome. So we were inside that border, the internal outsiders. I think Iraq as a child was like al-ghaib al-hadir. Yes. Yeah, and it's like, it's there, but it's not there.
It's not there.
And it's not there, but it's there.
Yeah.
And it's like you have a sort of tendency, as you may have seen it as well. Also, some of us sort of raised in diaspora, we will go through stages of our understanding of who we are and then our relation to the homeland, for example. So you've got the saying, "Li ma yaqdar yurqas yaqul al-qa'a wajh."
Yeah.
So feeling that sometimes you'd get among people in positions similar to our positions, maybe they might see themselves as better than Iraqis, or maybe they might, especially during the war on terror, as a way to disarm targeting, they might turn Iraqis or people like them into the butt of their jokes when they're around others in order to try and, break the ice or avoid kind of any problems. And it's a sort of a self-orientalism that can happen, I think, but by children mainly, because if you're seeing every day the depiction of people like you to be backwards, you're not learning about, there's something that I only discovered when I was older and I went to university and stuff like that. In the British Museum, there's one interpretation you can take from the British Museum, which is, okay, this is stolen goods.
Yeah.
Absolutely correct. But there's another interpretation you can take if you look carefully. So there's something called King Offa's coin in there.
Yes.
Now he was the ruler of Middle England when England was a heptarchy in Anglo-Saxon times. We're talking the 700s, and you have a coin which has the Shahada on it, La ilaha illallah Muhammadur Rasulullah, written in Arabic, which seems to be clear that it's a non-Arabic writer that's done this in order to kind of mimic the economic prowess of the Abbasiyin at that time. And even you look at like the fingerprints of Arabic on the English language. And one of the interesting ones in the Iraqi context is Ruz. So Ruz being developed in Iraq then becomes rice. In England. But then in the Iraqi context, after the British Mandate of Mesopotamia, it becomes Tinman. So you think about that sort of interesting exchange. You know, you've got Gahawa, coffee, sukkar, alif, ba, ta, alphabet. But these are all things as a child, you don't, I mean, I'm intending to translate these things to communicate these things to my son. So he's able to have a form of pride. But I think at that time, when a lot of what you're seeing is this sort of industry, which is based on depicting you and people like you, or people you may feel you have an affinity with, as ultimately backwards and prone to violence. And that's simply because the state has adopted a hostile posture towards you. That's not because that's representative of the Iraqi population. That's not because of anything like that. You are a targeted population. And so, you know, all of that takes a long, long time to realize and form a healthy relationship with. I think that's the most important thing. And, you know, as you will know, you know, we're trying to raise healthy children here, and children that have a sense of self, which is not defined by those who seek to dominate the countries of origin.
What do you hear young people worried about? What do they ask? What kind? I know that, you know, I have 2 grown-up boys, and I always tell them that they should be ready for a very, very tough world. And they sometimes joke and they say, "Well, thank you for ruining the world for us." But
it's so hard. Talking to kids is so hard.
It's very hard.
You have to find a happy medium. You don't want to scare them too much.
But yeah, what do young people tell you? What are they worried about?
I mean,
do they think about the things that you tell them? Do they think about those
kind of this long-winded connections?
Does it help the conversation?
That's a good question. I mean, I think if we were to kind of try and break down the core of what both they, you, and me are worried about, it is a political system which cannot assimilate their problems, their hopes, their fears, what they want to see in the world, the things they care about. And I think that what I do with the music is probably symptomatic of a political system which cannot integrate this point of view. You know, we saw the attempt with Jeremy, we saw the attempt with others across the years to try and bring in to those corridors of power these kind of what I would like to think are sort of pro-people ideas. And so when that's not reflected in the political system, people will look for it outside of the system. And so I think one of the interesting things with the music industry is it's no different from other sort of reflections and manifestations of power. It has all the same kind of dynamics within it, meaning that unfortunately the music, and I would say it's progressively got worse the older I've got, because for me, rap taught me empathy. That was the thing that rap taught me. I was able to listen to somebody on a very intimate level, hear about their daily concerns, and often people who had different lives to me. And so I was, through rap, placing myself in somebody else's shoes. And that is a great thing, you know, for that to happen to young people. But then the older I've got, the more and more corporatized I feel it's got, the more and more kind of as a handmaiden to the dominant economic system. It becomes a kind of a vehicle, a conduit for advertising, you know, and also even on the community level. You know, I'm from Ladbroke Grove. I care about the children there. I've known them, watched them grown up, and I've seen them get pushed in certain directions, not just by the music, by the cultivation of particular forms of belonging which I would say determine people's value based on their ability to take part in nihilistic, socially violent acts.